The wind howled like a banshee across the vast, empty sea, and the decrepit oil rig loomed on the horizon, a rusted metal skeleton jutting out of the water, alone and forsaken. They called it Rig 13, and it had been abandoned for over a decade. Legends swirled about what happened out there: a gas leak, a catastrophic fire, whispers of men who simply vanished without a trace. But all the official reports agreed on one thing: the entire crew was gone, and the rig was cursed. Cal was the leader of the small salvage crew hired to inspect and dismantle Rig 13. He didn't believe in curses, only in the paycheck waiting on the other side. The job was straightforward: get in, evaluate the condition, and retrieve anything salvageable. They arrived at dawn, the fog thick and suffocating as the rig's silhouette grew larger. The sea was calm, but the air was too still. They pulled their small motorboat alongside the rig's ancient boarding platform, clanging their way up the corroded metal ladder to the deck above. It was as if time had stood still. Rusting tools lay scattered, abandoned. Helmets and boots were covered in barnacles, a silent reminder of the men who had once worked there. The salt air carried a stench, like rotting fish, mixed with something foul and unnatural. Every step echoed, as if the rig were a giant hollow drum. They split up to cover more ground. The team was small: Cal, his old friend Mason, the rookie Jake, and Tanya, their tech expert. Tanya's job was to check the control room, power up whatever systems she could, and pull any data from the servers. The others would search the living quarters and storage bays. They carried radios, but as they moved deeper into the guts of the rig, the static on the channels grew louder. Tanya's voice crackled through the radio. Found the control room. It's colder here and dark, turning on the generator. Her voice was strained, unsettled. A loud hum vibrated through the structure as the emergency lights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the metal corridors. Cal moved toward the sleeping quarters. He felt a chill, and it wasn't from the wind. The air seemed to thicken, and each step felt harder than the last. The door to the barracks creaked as he pushed it open, revealing narrow bunks lining the walls, still neatly made. Personal belongings were scattered: books, photographs, mugs left half full, covered in mold. Cal's eyes locked onto a picture pinned to the wall. A crew smiling in front of the rig, their faces illuminated by sunlight. One of them had his eyes scratched out. Meanwhile, Mason was in the mess hall, his flashlight sweeping across overturned tables and broken chairs. He paused as he heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, a sound like fingernails against metal. He swung his flashlight toward the source, but there was nothing. The tapping stopped. Heart pounding, he moved to the galley, where pots hung from hooks and utensils lay strewn across the floor. Something scuttled past his feet: a rat. He breathed a sigh of relief, but the tapping began again, louder this time, coming from the ceiling. Jake's voice suddenly cut through the radio, barely a whisper. There's something here. I think I saw someone." Cal's radio buzzed with static. "Jake, report. What did you see?" No answer. He swore under his breath and turned back, the dim emergency lights casting grotesque shadows that danced with each shift of the rig. There was a sudden screech, metal grinding against metal, from somewhere below. Then, silence. In the control room, Tanya was furiously tapping at the ancient keyboard, her breath hitching as she read through fragmented logs and malfunction reports. Something was wrong. The maintenance records were corrupted, timestamps missing. A single line of data kept repeating: "Do not leave." She heard a noise behind her, a soft shuffling like footsteps, just as the monitor went black. Her flashlight flickered. She spun around, and for a split second she thought she saw a man standing in the doorway, staring at her with hollow eyes. Then he was gone. The emergency lights died. The rig plunged into darkness. Cal's flashlight wavered, the batteries already fading, and he hurried back the way he had come. Every corridor looked the same, twisting and narrowing as if the rig were changing, reshaping itself. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His radio crackled to life. Tanya's voice, frantic and barely audible: "Cal, something's in here. I can't." Her words cut off with a sharp, guttural scream. Cal ran. He was back in the mess hall when he saw Mason standing perfectly still, staring at the ceiling. "Mason!" Cal shouted. His friend didn't move. Cal approached, waving a hand in front of his face. Mason's eyes were wide and glassy, his mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-sentence. Then, in a sudden, jerky motion, Mason lifted his arm and pointed toward the kitchen. There, in the shadows, was Jake. No, what was left of Jake. His body was contorted, arms bent at impossible angles, his head twisted around to face backward. His lips moved, but the voice that came out was not his own. It was deep, guttural, and layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "Why did you come back?" Cal stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a broken chair. He grabbed Mason by the arm and dragged him toward the exit. They needed to get off the rig, now. The way out was a blur, a maze of echoing footsteps and distant whispers. They burst through the door to the platform, out the sea crashing violently below. Cal turned to Mason, but he was gone. No trace, no sound, just gone. He didn't stop. He scrambled down the rusted ladder, his hands slick with sweat and salt water, and fumbled with the motorboat's engine. It roared to life. He cast one last glance at the rig. A figure was standing there on the platform, watching him, its face obscured by the shadows. Then the fog closed in, swallowing the rig whole. The storm hit as he reached the shore. No one believed his story. The Coast Guard found nothing. No rig, no evidence, no bodies. They said the sea had swallowed it years ago, pulled it under during a storm. But Cal knew what he'd seen. He knew the rig was still out there, waiting. He still wakes up in the middle of the night, hearing the sound of tapping, growing louder and louder until it feels like it's coming from inside his own skull. He doesn't go near the ocean anymore. But every so often, when he's driving along the coast and the fog rolls in, he swears he can see a faint, dark silhouette on the horizon, a shape that wasn't there before, lingering just long enough to send a shiver down his spine. Cal never talks about the others, not even about what happened to Mason. But he keeps a single photograph, tucked away in a drawer, far from prying eyes. A picture of a crew smiling in the sunlight in front of Rig 13. One face, with the eyes scratched out. The ink on the back has almost faded, but if you look closely, you can just make out 2 words scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Do not return." The storm had come out of nowhere, crashing waves and lightning streaking the sky in jagged flashes. Ethan gripped the wheel of the old fishing boat as it shuddered in the angry sea. He had been searching for a missing ship, a trawler that had vanished without a trace 2 weeks prior. All he found was this: the cold, endless storm that dragged him farther and farther from shore. Just as he thought he'd have to turn back, something enormous loomed through the rain and mist. An oil rig, an uncharted one, rising out of the waves like a rusted colossus. His heart skipped. He had sailed these waters his whole life, and there was no rig here. But now there it was, towering and twisted, its dark metal skeleton shrouded in sheets of rain. The waves drove him toward it, and soon he was tying his boat to the platform, desperate to escape the furious sea. A rope ladder hung limply over the side. He climbed up, his hands numb and trembling, and hauled himself over the edge onto the slick, deserted deck. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only a small circle of the ancient rig. Wind whistled through the metalwork, sounding almost like faint whispers. The platform was enormous, a labyrinth of twisting corridors, rusting railings, and abandoned machinery. Every step echoed. The hairs on Ethan's neck stood on end as he realized that the rig wasn't abandoned. There were signs, recent signs, that someone or something had been there. Wet footprints tracked across the steel floor leading toward the central tower. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He tried the radio, but it was dead, only static. There was no choice but to go deeper. He followed the footprints, feeling his pulse in his throat, the sound of his breathing almost too loud in the suffocating quiet. The stairs creaked as he climbed, and the wind carried with it an odd, low hum, like the distant sound of a foghorn. He paused at a landing, shining his flashlight down a long, narrow corridor lined with sealed doors. Something wet and dark dripped from the ceiling, a thick, oily substance that stank of rot. He recoiled, but a sound made him freeze. Laughter, soft, faint, and unmistakable. A child's laugh echoing from somewhere deep within the rig. He spun around, but he was alone, the laughter fading into the groaning wind. Shaking, he forced himself to move forward, up and up toward the tower's control room. He had to know what was up here, what was waiting. He could feel it, like the rig itself was breathing, a giant slumbering beast that had finally awakened. The control room was worse than he imagined. Rusted equipment lay scattered, and the glass windows were stained with something black and oily, almost as if the sea itself had bled into the room. On one of the consoles, an old VHS tape sat, untouched and dusty. It was unlabeled. His hands shook as he pushed it into the ancient player. The screen crackled to life, displaying nothing but static for a moment. Then it cut to a scene. It was the rig, this very rig, only it was bright and bustling with workers, dozens of them, laughing, moving equipment, running drills. He watched, transfixed, as they went about their duties. Then the camera panned down to the lower decks, showing more of the structure. Ethan's stomach twisted. The footage was showing areas he had just walked through. The workers were there too, but their smiles had faded, and they moved in stiff, jerky motions, almost like puppets. A loud knock rattled the control room door, startling him so violently that he nearly dropped the flashlight. He stood frozen, staring at the door, waiting. The knock came again, 3 hard, deliberate bangs. "Who's there?" he shouted, but the only answer was silence. He inched forward and opened the door. The corridor was empty, but there on the floor were fresh footprints, trailing off to the left. They were wet and dark, as if made by someone who had just walked out of the ocean. Ethan's flashlight flickered and died. Panic clawed at his throat, and he stumbled back to the control room, slamming the door shut. He could hear something outside dragging across the floor, a heavy, scraping sound like metal being pulled. The VHS continued playing, now showing the workers again. Only they weren't right. Something was wrong with their faces. Their eyes were empty, staring, and their mouths twisted into wide, unnatural grins. One of them, tall, thin, wearing a bright red jacket, slowly turned to look directly at the camera, eyes burning with a cold, malignant light. He raised a hand, pointing. The footage cut to black. The door banged again, harder this time, and a cold wind swept through the control room, even though the windows were sealed. His flashlight suddenly buzzed back to life, flickering madly, casting long, swaying shadows across the room. He had to get out, had to escape whatever nightmare he had walked into. He flung open the door, racing back down the way he'd come, feeling the walls press closer with every step. The stairwell felt endless, each flight tighter and darker. Then he saw it. A figure at the bottom of the stairs, standing perfectly still, tall, thin, in a red jacket. It was watching him. His breath hitched and he spun around, sprinting up instead, his footsteps ringing hollow in the empty air. The humming sound grew louder, and he felt the rig shift beneath his feet, like it was alive and moving. He burst out onto the upper deck, the storm even worse now. Waves crashed violently against the base of the rig, and lightning split the sky. Ethan's boat was gone, dragged away by the storm or something else. Desperately, he looked around for any way out, any way off. He spotted the crane at the edge of the platform and ran for it, hearing footsteps behind him. Quick, and steady. Just as he reached the crane, he glanced back. There were figures, dozens of them, standing in the rain, staring at him with empty eyes. He recognized them from the tape. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. A shadow passed over the moon, and for a split second, he saw the water far below, dozens of pale faces just beneath the surface, eyes wide open, mouths gaping as if screaming. Something heavy landed behind him, and a cold hand gripped his shoulder. He turned, but there was nothing there. A whisper, cold and damp, brushed his ear. "Come home," it said. Then he was falling, plunging over the side, the icy water swallowing him whole. He woke on the shore, soaked and shivering, the storm gone as if it had never been. His boat was there, untouched, as if he'd never left. He told his story to the authorities, but no one believed him. They said there was no oil rig out there, no evidence of any structure at all. He tried to forget, but every night he dreamed of that rig, of the figures in the storm and the faces in the water. Sometimes when he's by the ocean, he swears he can see something out there, far on the horizon, a shadowy shape that wasn't there before. The last time he went back, his old boat was waiting, and on the deck was a single red jacket drenched in dripping seawater. He never told anyone, but he keeps the VHS tape locked in a drawer, hidden under piles of junk. He swears he'll never watch it again, but every night the hum comes back, growing louder and louder until he can't hear his own thoughts. It's calling him back, and deep down, he knows that one day he'll have no choice but to return. The beacon of the abandoned oil rig blinked weakly through the thickening fog. The rescue team had been called out to investigate a distress signal. The old rig, known as Coldwater Station, had been decommissioned years ago. A skeleton crew had stayed behind for maintenance, but the last supply ship had found the place empty a month ago, and all attempts to contact the rig since had failed. Now, that same rig was signaling for help. Jason, the team leader, checked the coordinates on his map as they approached. The rig looked like a massive metal tomb rising out of the black waves. Its lights were barely flickering, casting ghostly reflections across the icy water. The team, Jason, Lou, Sarah, and Marcus, climbed the rusted ladder and pulled themselves onto the main deck. They had their orders: locate the source of the distress signal and ensure no one was left behind. They were to stay together. But that plan fell apart the moment they set foot on the deck. Lou, the technician, went ahead to check the generator. "I'll be back in 10, he said, vanishing into the shadows. Jason watched him go, feeling a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. The place was dead quiet. A low fog blanketed the rig, muffling the sound of the waves below. Sarah, their medical expert, shivered, clutching her first aid kit tighter to her chest. The radio crackled as Lou's voice came through. "Generator's down. Looks like someone tried to restart it, but I don't know. Everything's out of place." Then silence. Jason called for a status check, but there was no answer. Frustrated, he signaled for Sarah and Marcus to follow him. They headed toward the living quarters, the only sound the metal creaking beneath their boots. The rooms were a mess. Furniture overturned, papers scattered, bunk beds still made. It looked like the crew had left in a hurry. Marcus noticed it first. A series of crude, childlike drawings scrawled on the walls in dark, jagged lines. Each picture showed the same thing: a group of stick figures standing on the rig, and something massive rising out of the water behind them, a shadowy shape with too many limbs. "Kids don't draw on oil rigs," Sarah said nervously, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason moved to the next room, where a rusted door stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the bowels of the rig. "Lou?" he called, but only his echo answered. He pulled out his flashlight, the beam wavering. They descended, the air growing colder with every step. They reached the lower deck, and the stench hit them. A foul odor, like old seaweed and something long dead. The flashlight revealed the source: thick, black sludge covering the walls and floor, glistening wetly. It dripped from the ceiling in heavy, oozing drops. Marcus gagged, turning away. "What is that?" he muttered, wiping his mouth. But Jason didn't answer. He had spotted something in the corner, a radio, half buried in the sludge. It was old and cracked, but still operational, blinking steadily. Someone had left it there, transmitting a distress call on repeat. Jason grabbed the radio, shaking off the sludge, and tried to adjust the frequency, but a voice came through instead. Soft and garbled, barely more than a whisper. "Help! It's still here. Don't go down. It's hungry." The flashlight flickered, and then they heard it, the soft, scraping sound of something moving in the dark, just beyond the edge of the light. Jason spun around, but there was nothing there. Marcus swore under his breath, backing away, while Sarah's face turned ashen. They needed to find Lou and get out. Now. Jason led them back up, each step slower than the last, every shadow suddenly feeling like it was watching. They emerged onto the main deck, but Lou was gone. Only his toolbox remained, tipped over and empty. Jason's radio buzzed again, and he lifted it to his ear, praying for a clear signal. Instead, he heard Lou's voice, a guttural whisper, repeating the same word over and over: "Drown, drown, drown." Then silence. "Lou?" he shouted, spinning in circles, scanning the fog-covered deck. The mist seemed thicker now, pressing in on them, turning the rig into a floating island cut off from the world. He could feel eyes on him, dozens of them, hidden somewhere in the shadows. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. But when they turned back toward the platform where their boat was moored, the ladder was gone, ripped away as if by some massive force. The water below churned violently, as if something huge was moving just beneath the surface. Jason felt the deck shudder, the metal groaning as if under great strain. "Up to the tower," he ordered. It was their only choice now. The higher they went, the worse the smell became, the air tinged with salt and rot. They reached the observation deck, and that's when they saw it. A figure stood in the center of the room, facing the window, tall, skeletal, with thin, dripping hair hanging in wet clumps over its face. It wore a tattered, oil-stained jumpsuit, and its hands were twisted and wrong, bent at impossible angles. It didn't move, even as they approached, as if unaware of their presence. Jason's heart stopped. It looked like Lou, but it wasn't. Slowly, the figure turned. Its eyes were gone, Empty, black sockets that dripped with the same thick black sludge that covered the lower deck. Its mouth opened wide, unnaturally wide, and a choking, gurgling sound emerged. "You shouldn't have come," it said in a voice that was both Lou's and something else, something deeper, something hungry. Marcus screamed, stumbling back, but the figure moved with sudden predatory speed, crossing the room in seconds. It lunged at him, dragging him to the floor. Sarah tried to pull him back, but the figure's hands, those awful, twisted hands, wrapped around Marcus's throat, and the room was filled with his strangled gasps. Jason grabbed Sarah, yanking her away, and together they fled, leaving Marcus's screams echoing behind them. They ran through the winding corridors, up and down staircases that seemed to stretch on forever. The fog was thicker now, suffocating, and the deck beneath their feet seemed to shift and sway like a living thing. Every corner, every shadow felt alive. Jason's radio crackled again, and this time it wasn't Lou's voice, but a chorus. A blend of voices, rising and falling in a maddening chant. Down, down, down. They reached the helipad, the highest point on the rig. Below, the sea churned violently, the waves black and bottomless. Sarah sobbed, clutching Jason's arm as the fog closed in, obscuring everything but the black water and the rig. He had one last idea, a flare. He dug it out of his pack, his hands shaking as he struck the igniter. It hissed to life, casting a red glow across the thick mist. A face emerged in the fog, pale and bloated, eyes wide and empty. Then another, and another. They were surrounded, dozens of faces, some familiar, others horribly distorted, all floating just at the edge of the light, staring. The chanting grew louder, the air heavy with salt and decay. The deck shook, and Jason's heart pounded as the helipad began to tilt, sliding toward the sea. He fired the flare, sending it arcing high into the night. It illuminated the scene for a brief, horrifying second, revealing the rig for what it truly was, covered in hundreds of those figures, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching upward, mouths open wide. Then the flare died, and the darkness swallowed them. The platform collapsed. He and Sarah fell, the icy water enveloping them instantly. He tried to scream, but the water filled his lungs, dragging him down, down, down into the endless black. He saw them, those faces, swimming around him, pulling him deeper, hands cold and wet against his skin. He saw Lou's twisted face, eyes empty, staring, mouth still moving with that awful word, drown. Jason woke up on the deck of a rescue ship, coughing up seawater. Sarah was gone. They said they found him floating alone, clinging to a piece of wreckage, delirious and half-drowned. There was no sign of the rig, and the Coast Guard insisted it never existed. But he knew what he had seen, knew that the rig was still out there, somewhere in the Black Sea, waiting. He couldn't forget the faces, couldn't forget the cold, dead eyes staring up at him from the dark water. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that chant, down, down, down. They called him crazy, but he knew he wasn't alone. A month later, another distress signal went out from Coldwater Station, a ghost signal, identical to the one they had followed. Jason threw his radio into the ocean that night, but he still heard it, echoing through the walls of his house in the dead of night. The beacon kept calling him back, and deep down he knew that one day he wouldn't be able to resist.